How can someone who was told she could never be a mother now have 3 children? It sounds impossible, doesn't it? That's exactly what I thought too. When I heard the doctor say those harsh words, "You will never get pregnant," it felt like a sentence had been written over my life. I cried until I had no strength left. I questioned God, and I'll be honest, I almost lost my faith. But it was in that place of pain that I discovered something many people don't believe. A diagnosis is not the final word. My name is Heidi Robbins. I'm 44 years old, and I live in Indianapolis, Indiana. For many years, I carried the heavy weight of an empty motherhood that never came. I lived through the quiet reality of failed attempts, hidden negative tests tucked away in a drawer, and prayers that seemed to go unanswered. What changed my life wasn't a new medical technique, but a God who works right where science says this is impossible. What looked like the end became a brand new beginning. And today, I want to share how I went from an infertility diagnosis to the joy of holding not just one, but 3 miracles in my arms. Get ready. My story might just change the way you see your own battle. Ever since I was little, I've always seen myself as someone who carried a deep sense of hope inside. I grew up in a busy city where life moved fast, but my heart was always searching for something beyond the routine, a greater purpose. I already understood that my faith in God would be the foundation for everything I went through. But I had no idea how much that faith would be tested. Life in Indianapolis is full of contrasts. Tall buildings, heavy traffic, but also quiet streets, welcoming churches, and neighbors who still take the time to stop and talk. I like that balance because it reminds me that God always finds ways to steady our days. When I go for walks around the neighborhood, I often think about how every face carries a story. And mine, in particular, was shaped by a deep longing to become a mother. For me, motherhood was never just a distant dream. It was a daily prayer, something I carried in my heart as if it were already part of who I was. Some people dream of big careers, traveling the world, or financial success. Of course, I had plans too, but nothing compared to the longing of having children running around my home. That was the story I believed God had written for me. I remember the times I would watch families gathered in the parks of Indianapolis, laughing together, sharing picnics. Sometimes I would smile just imagining what it would be like to be in that place, surrounded by my own children. It felt as if God planted little seeds in my heart, giving me a glimpse of what was yet to come. Those images became the fuel for my prayers. But life doesn't always happen the way we expect, does it? I thought that because my desire was so pure, and because I trusted God so deeply, everything would be simple and happen quickly. That soon I would live the testimony of motherhood. But little by little, I realized my path wouldn't be that straightforward. In fact, that was exactly the point where my story began to take a shape I could never have imagined. And that's where the next chapter of my journey begins, where I'll share how this dream of motherhood was formed in me from a young age and how it became an essential part of my identity. From a very young age, I felt that motherhood was not just a desire, but a calling God had placed in my heart. While some of my friends dreamed of pursuing specific careers, traveling, or achieving great success, I always pictured myself surrounded by children, imagining what it would be like to care for every detail of their lives. It was as if the silent prayer of my heart was always saying, "Lord, prepare me to be a mother." I remember helping in the children's ministry at church. Every time I held a baby in my arms or told Bible stories to the little ones, my heart was filled with joy. That's when I realized that motherhood was so much more than giving birth. It was about dedicating yourself, teaching and reflecting God's love through simple actions. For me, those moments already felt like a preview of what I longed to experience in my own home. There were nights when I would lie in bed imagining the names of my future children. I even kept a notebook where I wrote down ideas, almost like I was drafting the story I hoped to live. I planned how I would decorate their room, what songs I would sing to help them fall asleep, and what values I would teach them. Looking back, it's almost funny because all of this happened before I was even in a serious relationship. But that's how strong the desire burned inside me. At school, whenever someone asked what I wanted to be when I grew up, my answer often surprised people. I want to be a mother. Some laughed, others thought it was strange, but I would say it with conviction, not because I lacked professional ambitions, but because I knew no achievement could ever fill the space in my heart reserved for the children I so deeply longed for. Of course, part of me believed it would all happen naturally. Get married, have children, raise them, and live that blessing without major challenges. I never imagined that such a simple and genuine dream would also become a battleground for my faith. But now I can see that every detail of that desire was preparing me to understand that God writes stories in ways we never expect. And that's when another chapter of my life began, when I met Aaron, my husband. I knew in my heart that meeting him was another step God was aligning so that the dream of motherhood could finally begin to take shape. When I met Aaron, I felt that God was giving me not only a partner, but someone who shared the same dreams and values I had. He had a steady faith, a kind heart, and a calmness that completed me. Our wedding was filled with joy, surrounded by friends, family, and prayer. Standing at that altar, I truly felt as if the Lord was smiling on us. In the first months of marriage, we lived the excitement every newlywed couple knows. We built our home, made plans, and among them, the greatest of all, starting a family. Every conversation about children turned into joyful plans, like we were piecing together a puzzle I had been dreaming of since my youth. It was a sweet season, full of hope. We started trying to have a baby without worrying too much about timing, believing that the good news would come soon. I even imagined how I would surprise him the day the test finally showed positive. I had already bought a card to save and give him as a surprise, just waiting for the right moment. Each month, our expectations grow, and faith accompanied us in every prayer before bed. Aaron and I had even agreed on some funny details. He said he wanted our first child to be a boy so he could teach him sports, while I dreamed of a little girl who would wear colorful dresses and bows in her hair. We laughed, talked about names, as if the arrival was only a matter of days. That lightheartedness fueled our hearts, and it felt like nothing could stand in the way. But as time went on, we began to notice that the wait was stretching longer than we expected. 1 month passed, then another, and the silence of a negative result started to weigh on us. Still, I didn't want to worry too soon. My faith reminded me that everything has its time. So we kept trying, praying, and believing that soon we would live our very first testimony as a couple. And it was in that space between hope and waiting that we began to feel the weight of the first disappointments, the ones that would test not only our marriage, but also our faith in God. As the months went by, the excitement slowly gave way to a quiet anxiety. Each new cycle brought the hope of finally seeing those 2 lines on the test. But without fail, the result was negative. I smiled on the outside, but inside, every empty answer felt like a fresh wound. Aaron tried to encourage me, saying, "Our time will come," and I wanted to believe it with all my heart. There were days when I bought pregnancy tests in secret, without telling anyone, just so I wouldn't have to carry the weight of seeing disappointment on the face of someone who loved me. I would throw them away quickly, as if that could erase the pain. In those moments, prayer became my refuge. I would close my eyes, take a deep breath, and whisper, "Lord, I know you can do this, but when will my day come?" Tears often became part of my routine. I remember one night in particular when I locked myself in the bathroom just to cry without Aaron noticing. The sound of running water was my disguise. I didn't want him to feel guilty or helpless, so I swallowed the pain in silence. But that silence felt like a heavy stone pressing on my chest. It's strange how the human mind works in moments like these. I started noticing pregnant women everywhere, in the grocery store, at church, even walking through the neighborhood. It felt as if God was testing my heart at every corner. I prayed, but I'll admit, I also questioned, why is it so easy for them, and for me, it feels impossible? That kind of comparison only deepened my frustration. Still, I tried to keep a face of faith. I stayed involved in church activities, helped in the children's ministry, and smiled at people. But inside, it felt like there were two versions of me. The Heidi who trusted in God's work, and the Heidi who cried into her pillow every night. That tension was painful, but at the same time, it pushed me to seek God's presence even more. And it was right in that season of anguish and silence that the moment finally came to face something bigger, the decision to seek medical help and hear once and for all what might be happening to me. After so many failed attempts, Aaron and I decided it was time to look for answers. I scheduled an appointment with Dr. Patricia Howell, a well-respected gynecologist in Indianapolis. I remember how my hands were sweating as I filled out the forms at the reception desk. With every word I wrote, it felt like I was silently confessing my helplessness in the face of this dream. When I walked into the office, I was greeted with a professional but steady smile. Dr. Patricia asked several questions, went through my medical history, and ordered detailed tests. Beside me, Aaron held my hand, trying to give me a sense of security. I looked at him and thought, if it were only up to us, we would already be parents by now. But life doesn't happen according to our will. The days waiting for the results were agonizing. Every phone call from the clinic made my heart race, until finally the day of the follow-up arrived. I will never forget the feeling of sitting in that chair across from the doctor with the test papers on the table. It was as if time itself had slowed down. My prayer in that moment was simple. Lord, whatever it is, give me strength to endure. And then came the words that shattered my world. Heidi, you will never get pregnant. Short, direct words, but they echoed inside me like thunder. I felt my body go cold, my mind completely blank. Aaron tried to respond, to ask questions, to search for alternatives, but all I could hear was that sentence replaying in my head. The doctor calmly explained the medical reasons, talked about statistics, alternative treatments, even the possibility of adoption. But none of that reached my heart. I could only think, never. That word was far too heavy to carry. In a single moment, it felt like the future I had always dreamed of was erased completely. We left the office in silence. Aaron held me tightly, but I didn't even have the strength to cry. Deep inside, I knew that this appointment wasn't just a medical diagnosis. It was the beginning of an even greater battle, the clash between the pain of impossibility and the faith I claimed to have in God. That night, after the appointment, I lay in bed unable to sleep. The diagnosis echoed in my mind like an irreversible sentence. You will never get pregnant. The more I tried to push that phrase away, the louder it came back. It was as if a heavy weight had fallen on me, stealing my breath and draining the color from my days. I felt shattered, like a vase broken into 1,000 pieces. Tears became my most common language. I cried in the shower, while cooking, while cleaning the house. Every corner of my routine reminded me of what I had lost, the freedom to dream. My prayer during that time wasn't one of gratitude or praise, it was a choked cry. Why, God? What did I do to deserve this? The pain felt greater than any words could express. Aaron did everything he could to comfort me. He held me, told me he loved me, and reminded me we were in this together. But inside, all I felt was emptiness. It wasn't just about not being able to have children. It felt as though my very identity had been stripped away. I wondered if I was still the same Heidi, the one who dreamed, who believed, who had faith. All of that felt so far away. There were nights when I would get out of bed and just sit in the living room, staring out the window at the city lights. Indianapolis looked so alive, while I felt so dimmed inside. The silence of the night carried with it questions that had no answers. I wanted to believe God was still with me, but my heart was drowning in sadness. Fear started to creep in. Fear of never becoming a mother, fear that my marriage might suffer. Fear even of drifting away from God. I felt like I was in free fall, with no idea where I would land. The future, which once looked like a field full of flowers, now seems like a dry desert with no signs of life. I was crumbling inside, and it seemed like nothing could lift me back up. But it's strange how, even at the very bottom, something inside us still whispers. It was fragile, almost impossible to notice, but there was a spark that told me this is not the final word. And it was from that small flame that another conflict began, maybe the deepest one of all, the struggle of my own faith. It was during that season of darkness that my faith was tested in a way I had never experienced before. I had always been active in church, involved in ministries, praying with passion, and speaking about trusting God. But when Dr. Patricia told me I would never have children, it felt like every prayer I had ever prayed had been wasted. I kept asking myself, if God is so powerful, why didn't He do anything? Doubts started multiplying inside me. I would read Bible passages that once filled me with hope, but now they felt distant, almost unreachable. Stories about miracles made me wonder, yes, God did that in the past, but does He still do it today? Would He really do it for me? Prayer, which used to be sweet, became a struggle. Many times I knelt down but couldn't find a single word to say. I'll be honest, I even felt a kind of spiritual envy. I saw people sharing testimonies about answered prayers, healings, open doors, miracles, and I felt left behind. It was as if heaven had a waiting line and I was always at the very end. Deep down, I knew envy wasn't from God, but that's exactly what desperation was stirring up in me. There were days I thought about stepping away from church. Being in a place of worship and joy felt so different from the storm I was living through. I would go to services, but my heart was cold and my mind was at war. I sang the hymns, but it was like the words never made it out of my soul. It was a silent battle between my pain and the faith that still refused to die inside me. Aaron kept trying to remind me of God's promises, but even that felt far away at times. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to hold on to everything I had always stood for, but there were moments when giving up seemed easier. By then, it wasn't just about infertility anymore. It had become a deep internal battle about who I was and what I truly believed. I often thought, does it even make sense to keep praying if nothing ever changes? And it was right there, at that breaking point, that God began to show me He never leaves us alone, even when we feel completely drained. The answer didn't come through some instant supernatural event, but through a genuine friendship that became one of the greatest sources of comfort in my journey. In the middle of my pain, God used someone very special to be a source of comfort. My friend Monica Turner. We met when we were young at church, and our friendship went through both the good and hard seasons of life. But it was during this time when my faith was shaking that she became even more present. Monica didn't show up with ready-made answers or rehearsed phrases. She came with silence, a hug, and prayer. I remember one afternoon when I had no strength left. Monica knocked on my door holding a homemade pie and a gentle smile. We didn't say much in that moment. She simply sat with me on the couch, held my hand, and started praying softly. That's when I realized that sometimes the greatest proof of love is simply being there, without needing big speeches. On other days, she would send me Bible verses that seemed to come straight from heaven at the right time. One of them deeply touched my heart. Those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy. Psalms 126:5. When I read that message on my phone, I cried again, but this time not out of despair. It felt as if God was saying, "I'm still here, and your tears are not in vain." Monica also reminded me of simple, practical things. When I didn't want to leave the house, she would insist, "Let's go for a walk. Let's stop by the bookstore. Let's grab some coffee." Small gestures that seemed ordinary, but they helped me breathe outside of that heavy atmosphere of constant pain. It's amazing how God uses ordinary people to pull us out of the pit without them even realizing the depth of what they're doing. One detail that marked me was how she always included my name in her public prayers at church. I stayed quiet, but I heard her ask God to restore my faith and to bring the miracle into my life. Knowing that someone was interceding for me with such dedication made me feel less alone. It was as if my weak faith could lean on hers. And it was in this atmosphere of friendship, prayer, and comfort that I began to notice small signs of hope growing again. But something was still missing, a word that would come directly from God to fully reignite the flame inside my heart. It was during a Sunday service that something unexpected happened. I was sitting at the back of the church, trying to go unnoticed, when Pastor Franklin Cole began preaching. He was talking about the story of Hannah, the woman who was unable to have children and poured out her soul to God in prayer. I had heard this passage countless times before, but that day, it felt like every word was meant just for me. As the pastor described Hannah's tears, I saw myself reflected in her story. He said, "Sometimes human diagnosis feels final, but God never closes a door without having something greater prepared." It was as if my soul, numb from pain, was being stirred awake. I cried silently, trying not to draw attention, but inside, I felt the Holy Spirit touching me in a special way. After the sermon, the pastor paused and said something I will never forget. There is someone here today who has been told by doctors that they would never be a mother. The Lord wants you to hear, this is not the final word. My whole body trembled. I knew that word was for me. It felt as if God had crossed the sky just to whisper directly to my heart. In that moment, a flame was reignited inside me. I can't say all my doubts disappeared instantly, but I felt a thread of hope that hadn't existed before. I left that service feeling lighter, as if I had been given a new chance to believe. When I got home, I shared what had happened with Aaron. He smiled and said, "I always knew God wasn't finished with our story." What's remarkable is that this word wasn't just emotional comfort. It became an anchor for my faith. Whenever doubts returned, I would remember. The Lord said this is not the final word. It was like carrying an invisible promise, yet as real as the air I breathed. And it was holding on to that promise that I entered a new season in my life, the season of waiting, a long, silent time, but one where I learned to live by faith and not by circumstances. The years that followed were a time of quiet learning. Each month that passed without news reinforced that my wait would be long, but also deep. I learned that trusting God doesn't mean being free from pain. It means walking with Him, even when everything feels on hold. Prayer became my daily refuge, and every tear mixed with pleas full of hope. During that time, I turned to activities that strengthened my spirit. I read devotionals, participated in Bible studies, and volunteered at church. Every practical action was a way to stay connected with God, even without understanding why the wait was so long. I discovered that waiting isn't being idle. It's cultivating active faith in the silence. Sometimes the loneliness was intense. I saw friends getting pregnant, families forming around me, and my heart ached. But in those moments, I learned to speak to God like never before, not with rehearsed words, but with genuine feelings. I would say, Lord, even if I don't understand, I want to trust that you know what's best for my story. Aaron was with me every step of the way. His words of encouragement, even on the most desperate days, were like small anchors thrown into my heart. Together, we learned to wait patiently, turning each disappointment into a lesson and each prayer into a strengthening of our bond. Faith, once fragile, grew quietly but firmly. It was also during this season that my friendship with Monica deepened even more. Her prayers, her attentive listening, and her gestures of care became bridges between my pain and hope. Every word of encouragement reminded me that we were not alone and that God works through the people He places in our lives to sustain us. And it was in this space of tears, prayer, and active faith that the impossible began to take shape. A miracle, which had seemed so far away, was about to appear unexpectedly and transform our entire story. I will never forget the day I found out I was pregnant with our first child. I was silent, barely believing the test results, and Aaron held my hand with tears welling up in his eyes. After so many years of prayer, waiting, and tears, that moment felt surreal. It was as if God had suddenly rewritten my story in a way that was unexpected and wonderful. The news spread slowly among our family and close friends. Monica was the first to know, and there was no greater celebration than her hugs and joyful tears with me. I remember her words were simple. I knew God still had something beautiful planned for you. It was then that I realized how faith and friendship walk hand in hand, supporting us in the darkest moments. The pregnancy wasn't just about waiting for a baby. It was about seeing how God responds in unexpected ways. Every appointment, every ultrasound, every heartbeat of our child was a quiet confirmation that He was present in every detail. I prayed constantly, giving thanks and asking for protection, as if I could hold onto each moment of tangible hope. Even with the joy, there was still fear. The worry of losing our baby, who had been so long awaited, was with me every day. But every time Aaron reminded me to trust, and with every prayer I said, something inside me grew stronger. I realized that true faith doesn't erase fear. It faces it, anchored in the certainty that God is faithful. When I saw Noah's face on the ultrasound for the first time, I felt a joy I can't put into words. It was the materialization of the impossible, living proof that God is never late. In that moment, I understood that all the tears, doubts, and sleepless nights had not been in vain. They had become testimony, lessons, a story of faith. And so our first miracle arrived, quietly yet powerfully. But God, in His abundance, still had more surprises in store for us. Little did I know that this was only the beginning of a series of blessings that would completely transform my life as a mother. After Noah was born, my life felt complete, but God, in His infinite goodness, still had more for us. Not long after, we discovered I was pregnant again. The arrival of Leah was an unexpected blessing, and a sense of gratitude filled our home. Every smile of hers felt like God reminding us that His promises never fail. Aaron and I would look at our children and realize that everything we had gone through, the waiting, the pain, the tears, had only been preparation to receive in abundance what we had prayed for. It was overflowing joy, but also a moment of reflection, understanding that true faith is rewarded in ways we could never plan. When Caleb, our third child, was born, the feeling of completeness reached a whole new level. Each child, with their own unique personality, was a living testimony of God's work in our lives. Looking at them together and seeing that the impossible had become reality made me want to share this story with everyone I know. It's impossible not to speak of faith when life itself becomes a miracle. The challenges from the beginning, which once seemed insurmountable, now took on a new meaning. Every tear shed, every moment of doubt, every silent prayer, all of it became experience, lessons, and a strengthening of our trust in God. Motherhood, which once seemed like a distant dream, was now an abundant reality. I also learned that the multiplication of a promise isn't just about quantity, but about the depth of God's love. He shows us that His blessings arrive at the right time, in the right way, and that the best is yet to come. Each child He gave us became a link that strengthens our faith and reminds us of His faithfulness. And looking at every smile, every gesture of affection, every mom and dad we hear, I understand that God not only fulfilled my dream, but multiplied it. And it is this realization that leads me to look back and reflect on the entire journey He led me through. When I look back, it's impossible not to be moved by every step of this journey. I remember the silent tears, the sleepless nights, the fear that felt unbearable, and I realized that all of it had a purpose. Every challenge, every heartfelt prayer, every moment of waiting became a lesson and a strengthening of my faith. God, in His quiet way, was building my testimony. Reflecting on the initial diagnosis and the words that struck me the most, "You will never get pregnant," I see how that early pain drew me closer to God. Today, I understand that every tear carried a hidden promise, and my story wasn't defined by infertility alone. It became a story of hope, perseverance, and unwavering faith. Looking at my children, Noah, Leah, and Caleb, every smile, every gesture, every hug shows me how God's faithfulness appears in simple, everyday moments. Through them, I see realized what once existed only as a silent prayer in my heart. Motherhood has taught me to trust, to wait, and to give thanks for every small victory. I also see how the people God placed by my side were essential to this journey. Monica, Aaron, Pastor Franklin, and even Rachel, who accompanied me to appointments, were divine instruments that supported my faith. Without these connections, the path might have been harder, or my hope smaller. My story, which began with diagnosis and frustration, is now a living testimony of God's work. Every obstacle overcome has become a narrative of triumph that can inspire others. I've learned that God not only changes circumstances, but also transforms hearts and renews the faith of those who trust Him. And it is in this look back, full of gratitude and emotion, that I begin to realize God's faithfulness goes far beyond what we can imagine, preparing the ground for a final reflection on how He turns dreams into abundant reality. Looking back over my journey, I realized that God's faithfulness is greater than any diagnosis or human limitation. What once seemed impossible became reality, and the impossible turned into 3 lives that fill my home with joy and love. Every tear shed, every silent prayer, every moment of waiting had a purpose, and today they are part of my most precious testimony. I've learned that trusting God doesn't mean the absence of pain, but believing that He is working even when we don't understand the path. Every challenge I faced, from the infertility diagnosis to the long period of waiting, was an invitation to deepen my faith and learn that God always fulfills His promises at the right time. My story also shows the importance of valuing the people around us. Aaron, Monica, Pastor Franklin, and so many others were instruments of love and prayer that helped me hold on to my faith. These memories remind me that God uses people to support us and that together we are stronger on life's journey of faith. Today, I can say with confidence that the Lord didn't just restore my dream, He multiplied it. Noah, Leah, and Caleb are living proof that God can turn tears into joy and impossibilities into miracles. Every smile of theirs reminds me that faith is never in vain and that every prayer is heard, even when the answer takes time. If you are going through moments of despair or facing diagnoses that seem final, I want to tell you, don't give up. Your story isn't over yet, and what medicine cannot do, God can. He's an expert at writing happy endings where no one else believes it's possible. And if this story has touched you, share your own testimony in the comments. Subscribe to the Faith Story channel to hear more accounts of faith and triumph. And know that this is a space where we can all learn, pray, and inspire one another. God still has stories to transform and miracles to perform.